So this is what every CIO should know about cloud computing. This has been part of a FiRe series for 4 to 5 years now. We started talking about networks and virtualization and growing sizes of networks and new cloud operating models. And it was at a time when a lot of people didn't know what cloud computing was, what the potential, and I've noticed already in this week that cloud's been mentioned 12, 15 times. And so it's gotten to a point, I think, that it's peaked in terms of people talking about cloud computing, and Gartner and Information Week and IDG have all kind of started talking about the trough of disillusionment. So I think it's a really good time for us as a panel to really kind of clear the air about cloud computing, talk about issues around public-private cloud, differentiation, interest of enterprise, et cetera, economics. So what we've done as part of this whole theme about what every CIO should know about cloud is we brought some of the top people in the world in cloud computing to kind of offer their perspectives. So we have Dave Nelson from Boeing, James Barresi from PayPal, Winston Damaria from Morph Labs, Paul Strong, VMware, and Don Pickering from OneOcean. So we've had a few little discussions, but this is a very kind of, it's more of a spontaneous than a planned, scripted event. So you're very likely to hear things that we didn't even expect to say as part of this. So I'd like to start with the typical answer that every cloud panel in the last 2 years has had to have, but literally someone chime in, what is cloud? And what's the difference between a public and private cloud?
So there's been a lot of confusion about this, I guess, because everyone tries to sell a cloud or whatever, and we tend to think of it as technology. I would encourage, actually, that we think of it slightly different. What we really have with cloud is a fundamentally disruptive business model in terms of acquisition of IT. The notion of self-service, instantly provisioned, pay for what you use, scale up and scale down IT is fundamentally disruptive. We see it outside in the public cloud, providing opportunities for people. But we also see it inside in the enterprise. The mere existence of the Amazons of this world has reset the expectation that our business partners have in terms of what IT can deliver. So the status quo that's been there for 25 years of wait 9 months or whatever is basically gone, and that's what's driving this private cloud, which is using similar technologies inside the enterprise to deliver those same kind of capabilities.
So the private cloud is enterprise adopting operating models that mimic what the public cloud is delivering.
Delivering the same attributes, the notion of self-service where possible, transparent or pay-for-use cost models, instant provisioning, that kind of stuff.
So what's the deal with cloud? Why are enterprises, first of all, interested in cloud computing? Why did it get such a high level of buzz?
I think one quick answer is that it's kind of like the modernization of technology. When somebody starts using an iPhone or a smartphone, they're not going to go back. And for engineers and developers, what this means is instant provisioning, capacity on demand, fast time to market. And so if we can get this outside, we want it in our shop as well. So that's going to drive the adoption of cloud models inside companies.
Yeah, and from the Boeing side, really there's the economics, right? When I started about 4 years ago, we were doing early cloud. It was all about, OpEx, CapEx, the cost reduction. Yeah. It quickly moved into the agility. And what we really focus on is this idea of frictionless IT, so that consumerization where you can just get those resources on demand and have applications drive the infrastructure instead of the other way around.
Yeah, we've seen, we did a recent cloud adoption survey across Europe. And certainly for the first 3 or 4 years of cloud, it was heavily driven by cost savings. But we've seen a flip, so the majority of people are actually talking about agility, minimizing time to market, and things like that now.
Yeah, and the other thing that cloud has brought about is the unification of processes in developing IT inside the enterprise, right? So in addition to all the savings that you're going to get from an efficient use of architecture, you're also introducing efficient models of delivering software solutions, right? So developers tend to get access to infrastructure a little quicker. The infrastructure guys get to understand what the developers are developing for very quickly and can react to the variations of what the application is looking for. So in a lot of ways, it introduced new processes into the enterprise that hopefully, as beginning to prove that those efficiencies shorten the cycle time for developing software and delivering them as efficiently as possibly can be delivered in an infrastructure.
So we've talked about why enterprises are interested and why they're implementing it. Zynga recently announced that they were shifting their emphasis off of public cloud and into private cloud. What are some of the drivers for enterprises to literally already, before public cloud even perhaps fulfills the promise that the marketing has been delivering, what's causing them to move off?
There's a very clear cost model. At the end of the day, this is about CapEx and depreciation and return on investment. And what we've seen are models that say for a fixed infrastructure, if you're utilizing it enough, it makes sense to own it. If you've got a big enough footprint and you're using it constantly, the issue is when you start getting into spiky workloads. And when you start having things like disaster recovery. Disaster recovery is an expensive insurance policy. So what you're seeing is this combination of owned and a hybrid model, both inside your firewall and outside your firewall. And the art is going to be using both. What we've done some models, and we could spend, let's say, 5 times the cost on a per hour basis, and it's still more efficient to run in a hybrid model where you're running inside and outside.
Yeah, and we found a similar, one of our examples is that we won a contract with the Ministry of Defense in the UK, and as soon as we won that contract, we had to start being productive, and we didn't have a data center. So moving out to the external cloud just to do configuration, stand up the VMs, that kind of thing, we got that instant agility speed. Once we started burning those things at a flat rate, it was much more efficient and cheaper to bring them back in-house. So at that time, we'd actually built the data center. We were able to migrate those back in. So I think there's those use cases where you can get quick wins, quick speed, and then still move it back in for some of the benefits of being in-house.
Yeah, for predictable workload, private cloud is cheaper than public cloud, right? And I think the only thing that can bridge that gap completely for an enterprise to optimize your costs is to, we've talked a lot about this last night, standardization, right?
Yeah.
So if I write my code or my infrastructure to comprehend the value of elasticity in the public cloud, if I can bring that inside the enterprise and I can somehow bridge back to the public cloud, then that's really the true kind of nirvana for what people are looking for, right? I've got resources, I got one way to access it.
So the interesting thing with cloud, and one of the reasons that Zynga pushed back, is there's a fundamentally different economic model to delivery of cloud. So if we look across the traditional enterprise, a traditional large enterprise, I think you were saying yesterday, something like 6,000 different applications that get managed. Each one of those applications has to be sourced, designed, integrated, deployed, managed, monitored, archived, and everything else that goes with it. And that's actually the primary driver of cost in the enterprise. I mean, for the last 25, 30 years, 80 to 85% of the cost has been people and software, largely driven by managing all of this application portfolio. What we see in the cloud is that you get a kind of economy of simplification and specialization, not just of scale. The fact that an eBay or a PayPal has a very small number of patterns. When you have a small number of patterns, you can automate the hell out of them. Yeah. And at that point, your economy actually, you're driven so that your primary OpEx becomes energy, because infrastructure is 85% of your cost. Then you start doing all the interesting stuff about moving to interesting locations, minimizing the power consumed, maximizing the efficiency of the power supplies, and all the stuff that goes with that.
You raised a very interesting point about energy being probably the largest variable cost, right, in terms of IT.
Once you flip it into the cloud model, most enterprises aren't there. Their opportunity is either to leverage it outside in public cloud, or one of the opportunities we see in general is that once you put apps inside VMs, irrespective of a vendor to some greater or lesser degree, but once they're in VMs, it's a good enough proxy and the apps can look similar enough to each other for you to start getting some of those benefits.
Some of the companies I've talked to over the last 3 to 5 months have said that those that migrated off the public cloud, they felt that once you crossed a certain amount of server population or a certain amount of power consumption, they were quoting like about 500 kilowatts, that suddenly you want to have more control of your electrical mechanical infrastructure and optimization location where it's built, because if you're in a public cloud, to Winston's point, it is more expensive than private cloud, which I think some of the public cloud marketers have been, this is part of the misinformation that public cloud's always cheaper. but it really comes down to, I think the point you made is how often are you using the assets? If you're using them day in, day out, it's as cheap as owning or taking a taxi cab.
Yeah, and it's always
for
a
your
use
daily.
case model, because one of the
Yeah.
things we're finding, we do a lot of training, pilot training, mechanic training. A lot of training is very spiky, right? So they'll set up a course, it may run hard for a week, and then they'll shut it down and not run it. So I think, again, it's the workload model, and there's a lot of places like that we can leverage.
So, and I want to talk through a little bit about security and some of the unplanned downtime. Then I want to bring Don in to really kind of talk about promising projects and developments and where it can help in certain areas where you're trying to map the ocean, for example, and you don't want to invest in the IT, you'd rather invest in the oceanography and the measurement there. But so how is security in the cloud worked out? I was at a very horrifying presentation by a guy named Chris Hoff, who's at Juniper, and he's funny, he's brilliant, but he talked about the stack of turtles in the cloud and all these vulnerabilities and attack surfaces. Have those issues of security or what Herd called concerns, have they been fully addressed and solved? Have there been emerging startups and technologies, or are they still fundamental issues in the public cloud around security that are going to prevent some applications from migrating in the next 10 years?
I think there's progress in there. I think really if we think about security, it's not as simple as just security about the cloud. The things that really are inhibitors to adoption are the notion of security, and it's mainly around the data more than anything else. And then there's the regulatory compliance, really that geographically there are different rules with regards to management of that data and everything else. And so there is a block there. But it is being addressed. And I think one of the things that's fundamentally interesting, if we go back to this notion that cloud is about specialization, one can imagine that in the long term, there's a reasonable argument to be made, given that they can get genuine economies of specialization and scale, that in the long run, actually the services should be cheaper. But also, because of the amount of specialization, there is an opportunity for them to be far more reliable and far more secure, because you aren't spreading and peanut buttering all of your effort around making 6,000 applications secure. You're doing it for 2 or 3 key patterns, right?
And I've heard that same argument that data absolutely will be something people want to protect, but won't a cloud infrastructure and cloud vendors and other technologies be better at securing a consistent infrastructure than 100,000 small little company networks and firewalls? So you could make an argument that over time, the security will go up as a result of having that specialization.
Right, and that gets back to the whole platform issue and the standardization, because what we find is our 6,000 applications have every different version, every different patch level, and there's just a lot of vulnerabilities where, as I think the future, and we're there a little bit, is moving into these platforms which are more holistic and can be managed and are more secure
And
that way.
the same thing with unplanned downtime, availability because of the
Rolling
simplicity and
updates,
power.
yeah.
And really the important part from a CIO's perspective is you control your design, right? And that's the whole idea of cloud moving from public to private, and there's terms that have been resurfacing again called dynamic infrastructure, right? It's the idea that you have an idea of what your reusable, scalable, elastic infrastructure should look like, and that you control that base, right? And that from that base, you have the opportunity to engage externalized resources. Right? And that's turning the control of what cloud should be back to the CIO as opposed to be controlled by a service provider. And that's one reason also for a lot of people moving out of public cloud back into private cloud. Right? They're wanting to have that more deterministic design in their infrastructure, and then they can bring in whatever security models that's comfortable to them, or user management model that's comfortable to them, or data security, right, to a point that it makes sense to them, and have more control over how you go outside of it.
So, Don, we chatted this morning, and I was completely captivated by your ocean research and what you're trying to do, and it was so interesting. We almost got distracted off topic of talking about this. But could you, as we look forward to where public cloud and how it evolves could be very promising. We know it lowers the threshold of IT for technology-centric business plans, right, and investment. What impact do you see it having on it?
Well, I think quickly on the security front, I think there's an issue of objective security problems and then perceived security issues and sort of the impact that has on it. Clearly, military, oil and gas companies that are very security sensitive to data just aren't going to want to touch the public cloud, and probably for a long time. But I think that sort of going forward, as we've seen, particularly we're talking about organizing and managing GIS data, which is very sort of specific and has its own intricacies with it, that you'll see in time, I think, specialization of clouds and cloud services based on verticals. And for us and for our clients, we can't just go to the Amazon Web Services and necessarily just turn it on and make it work. There's a whole lot of issues that are specific to working with marine GIS data that, as we develop tools and technologies, and I think the integration of both infrastructure and software into sort of an organized, platform as a service, if you will, that you'll see specialization across verticals.
So we're already seeing that today. We see that with New York Stock Exchange. We see that in healthcare sectors, where really we're seeing suppliers who want to meet specific vertical industry demands, both in terms of the workload, but also in terms of compliance for their data.
Yeah, we see it like within the aviation industry. We see, a vertical standing up to do multi-fleet aviation cloud, right, between Boeing and other providers, right?
So it was when Mark Hurd was talking about simplifying IT.
Yeah.
It became apparent to me that one of Oracle's strategies in the future might be developing vertical cloud things and leveraging those. Is it like the Oracles and Informaticas and others of this world, are they going to be the leaders in this, or is it going to be a lot of hungry startups?
Well, it's interesting for Oracle to talk about simplifying IT, right?
Yeah,
So,
right.
I think that there is a very exciting pattern that's going on in the creation of technology for the cloud, and that is the amount of participation the open source community is bringing into the table, right? And it really brings to life the notion that there is no one pattern, and that there are several different types of workflow, and that we should enable as many of these variations of workflows to be optimized in a platform that gets created, right? So for me, what's the most interesting thing about cloud is OpenStack, right? It's 155 companies decided, including HP and Cisco, to participate in the creation of what's considered to be 80% complete software, right? And the rest of the 20% is optimization, for what we're intending to do. So it supports all the hypervisor there is. It supports any pattern of networking and software networking that we want to introduce to it, and licensing the Apache Software Foundation. So I think just like when Linux was becoming an anchor of server consolidation, right, there will be consolidation on how cloud workflow will behave, right? And projects like OpenStack is a good way to kind of bring that into a model where we can start working together, because the standards will take a long time, and it will take a lot of debate to do, but software is almost the de facto creation in terms of working together.
Yeah, I've obviously heard working software is a great standard.
Exactly.
So I think one of the things that's challenging about cloud for a CIO, though, is that we have this conversation a lot around the technology. Right. If we think about cloud, it's not just about infrastructure, it's about platforms, it's about software as a service. If you look at the long term, and I'm presuming maybe I'm segueing into your next question, but if we look at the long term, the opportunity for cloud ultimately is to source the IT that supports non-differentiating value as a commodity, ideally from outside the walls of your business. So software as a service and infrastructure as a service, they very rarely differentiate organizations. We run something like 25 software as a service applications that we consume inside VMware. And so really the opportunity that cloud presents, in the same way that the internet provided organizations with global access to markets or to demographics to sell their goods and services or to convey a message or whatever, the cloud is providing global access to IT resources from which to build businesses. It means that the CIO can change his partnership relationship with the business and sit there and say, well, there's a couple of things here. We can, if you tell us what the goal of the business is and your core differentiation and your value, then we can seek to push out all the non-differentiated IT as a commodity. But we can also invest in platforms. Platforms become the really exciting part, because infrastructure and software, you really want to minimize customization, just push it outside the door and just make it a commodity. But platforms are where you're able to leverage your existing IP, expose them, create ecosystems upon which both internally and externally you can deliver new value. And you can monetize other people's innovation. I mean, we see this with PayPal and eBay and the whole X-commerce thing, where it's about creating this virtuous cycle that drives innovation at a higher rate.
So some of the trends over the next 3 to 5 years, we talked about verticalization of public cloud, that improving. We talked about OpenStack. I think you also alluded to OpenFlow with the software-defined networking implications. You've talked about the platform. So we see infrastructure as a service kind of maybe giving way more to more emphasis on platform as a service and ultimately.
In the
is that
long
what
run,
you-
that's where the
Yeah.
true value can be extracted. If we look at the dynamics of the world, you know, OpenStack is very much catering to a new class of application, very much the AWS stuff, which comes from outside the business into. From our world, we have 350,000 enterprise class users who, by investing in virtualization already, they've started building a cloud. Whether they call it one or not, it's irrelevant.
Yeah.
They can consolidate, fine, and save money, but they can switch those things on and off instantly, which is the instant provisioning part. And when you wrap it around with self-service, and it comes back to, again, you have to reevaluate your processes,
Right.
not just your IT processes, but your business and your procurement processes to take advantage of this. Then you can turn yourself into this private cloud stuff.
So what do we see further out? Like, let's say 5 to 10 years? Is the next 10 years fairly homogeneous, or is there going to be interesting things that kick in 5 years, 10 years from now?
Well, starting from the bottom, I think the infrastructure is about to get extremely exciting, right? I mean, for the longest time, we have gone through Moore's law in processing, and memory has become cheaper. And what's substantially innovating right now is the storage. IOPS is hitting massive amounts of RAM. And if you imagine, for those of you who've got Macs and have solid-state machines, when you boot up your machine, it just works, right? And imagine putting 80,000 IOPS in every single compute that runs your apps. It's going to change how you write your apps. And it's going to change how your apps is going to get delivered. And that's at the very fundamental of computing. Right? If you know that, couple that with software-defined networking and a globally connected internet, that's going to change how we write apps.
Yep.
So for me, it's not just short-circuiting and shortcutting the platforms. We're not done with the innovation of what the platform can do to you, right?
Right.
Think about what 10-watt computing can do for you, right? Servers can now run at 10 watts, right?
Yeah.
If you run it in that. So there's substantial exciting
And
things going on.
I think the other place I find exciting is application development and the whole life cycle, right? So collaboration on these common platforms where there's now pipelines where bits of the software can be built and put in the pipeline and move through all the phases of the development, and we can collaborate globally now in ways where the infrastructure just lights up to support these things and the bursting. So I think that's a big thing coming.
Yeah, that's process automation,
Yeah.
right? That's a lot of things that are coming out in that.
Yeah.
I think the most, I'm sorry, James.
So a couple other points. Like everybody has multiple devices. You'll have more devices. So it's forcing developers and
interesting.
application creators to figure out how do they get your data in every one of these devices. That requires a cloud. So that's changing the model. And then the next level is this standardization. So remember that Amazon, IBM, HP, all these companies are putting billions of dollars of infrastructure, Microsoft, and they're building out massive data centers. And that, you can't compete necessarily, and so people are going to be adopting those technologies. And then when you get that standardization, suddenly you've got this ecosystem of my costs are lower, I can take advantage of these clouds very quickly, and my consumer application usage actually demands it. So we'll just see more and more applications created in this way.
I think that
Can you share Sybil with us?
Well,
with the audience?
there's a couple of things I can share with you. So I actually have a sensor in me. The reason I'm making noises here, which I hope you'll forgive me for, is I happen to be diabetic and I have a constant blood glucose meter on me, and it's reminding me that I should actually do a blood test, but I probably shouldn't do it on stage in front of you. The thing that annoys me with this is that it doesn't run straight to my iPhone right now, but we're fixing that. And so for me, this is exciting, but what this really tells us is something that's even, from my perspective, even more profound, because this is the world of sensors and capturing data. If we say that in the limit, cloud is about allowing organizations to focus on their core differentiating value, you have to ask the question, so how do I understand what that differentiation is? The answer is through customer intimacy or intimacy with your marketplace. You gain that through the digital artifacts of your interaction with your marketplace, with your customers, your consumers, the sensors that are out there on every single device, that are in your cars, that are in your home, that are in your diapers. I mean, and what you end up with is this vast amount of data that becomes a real-time streaming analytics platform. If you look at the work that we see today, the big data isn't just about doing number crunching in the background. You're personalizing every interaction in real time. you have a window of opportunity to do fraud analytics for, say, 30 seconds. The more algorithms you can do, the safer and more secure it's going to be. And if we look at how that changes infrastructure, which is why it's really super exciting in that space, is the building blocks for this are not the building blocks we've been using for traditional data centers. They have 20 spindles in them, plus some non-spindly stuff to accelerate the stuff, right? And they're connected in a different kind of networking. So there is lots of excitement. The CIO has to be aware of it. I would also argue the CIO probably doesn't want to care about it in the long run. He wants to be delivering new value really, really fast, cost efficiently, focusing on that differentiation, and leveraging his data, because that is the asset he owns on behalf of his business. Because he is the information officer, not the infrastructure
And managing
officer.
risk.
And managing risk, yeah.
So we have about 2 minutes and 40 seconds left for any kind of questions. You're not going to show the audience your phone that's running 2 instances of...
Very briefly,
It's pretty interesting.
just in case everyone thinks we're only interested down in the stack, we actually have a whole lot of software around applications and rewriting them and everything else. But this phone actually has a hypervisor on it. It runs 2 instances of Android, one of which is controlled via VPN by my IT department. I don't control the version of Android. They decide what apps I can use. They decide what I can share between my private and my home phone. When I lose it, they can wipe it. When I change device, they can snapshot it and restore it to my new device. So all of this stuff is interrelated. We talk a lot about the infrastructure, but to be honest, the infrastructure comes out all the way to here. The last 30 years of the story of the ebb and flow of application functionality and data backwards and forwards across the network as the price point and technology performance shifts and changes. And our job as providers in this space and consumers is to take advantage of that for the maximum benefit of our businesses and our stakeholders and our customers.
So any questions? There has to be at least one. Thank you. Thank you.
So in relation to the whole CIO question, because that's the title of your panel here, I think the most interesting thing about the cloud is, you know, it keeps layering up abstraction layers to the point where you're actually, the CIO is supposed to be information, right? Not just data.
Right.
And so just curious what you guys have to say about the ability to start doing really advanced temporal ongoing analytics and really producing information way beyond the data that, you know, and bringing those processes all together and leveraging the cloud for that. Where are the opportunities in the
Well, I
next
think one of
3
the
to 5
opportunities
years?
I think he alluded to is the sensors. So I was out last week walking the 787 line at Boeing and looking at, you know, where sensors could be, and right now capturing data about what a mechanic is doing, and as they move from one space to another, we can make assumptions of what they're doing and when they're closing tasks, and this becomes a big data problem, but it also becomes a very efficient way to not have them interrupted when we're moving through tasks. So once you get that platform, it's just amazing what can happen.
I would also argue the rate of innovation on the cloud and cloud services is so aggressive that you need to get your applications out there, because you won't be able to keep up with the expectations of your user. So imagine now voice communication, right? Now, next it's going to be computer vision. And then the advances will keep on going, and people will expect your application to keep up. So if you're not working in a cloud architecture, if your application isn't consuming those services, you're going to very quickly find yourself in a few years behind. So the time is now to make sure you're building new applications so that these next set of breakthroughs can be easily incorporated in what you do.
I think you said the time is now, and where's Mark? Normally there's a hook. Okay, there we go. All right, well, thank you, guys.
Sure.
Fabulous, thank you.